Good afternoon and good morning to our friends in the United States. I'm Bill Echikson and I'm joining you from Brussels. I'm director of the Digital Innovation Initiative at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, and I'll be moderating this discussion. Today, we're delighted to welcome you to the launch of our report, Perspectives on Europe's Digital Decade. It looks at the EU member states' diverse approaches towards digital policy and how those differences influence EU policymaking. It's been an exciting year here in Brussels. Two landmark pieces of legislation, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, have come into effect or been passed, and they really will revolutionize digital governance. So we wanted to take a look at how different countries in Europe are approaching the digital decade, the digital revolution, and to unpack that, we commissioned two reports, one report divided into 4 chapters, each profiling a specific country: France, Italy, Denmark, and Poland. And we're delighted here to be joined by each chapter's author. Annabelle Chapman is a freelance journalist and consultant who has covered Poland. Aurelien Portuese is director of the Schumpeter Project of Information Technology, and he covered France. Host Schmidt is a senior advisor at think tank Europa in Copenhagen, and he writes about Denmark. And Janna Brancolini is a journalist with Bloomberg in Milan who has covered Italy. Thanks for all of you to join us. This discussion is part of CEPA's Digital Innovation Initiative, and its goal is to advance transatlantic unity on digital regulation. Before we begin, we'd also like to extend a special thanks to Microsoft for their partnership. With that being said, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers to kickstart the conversation. If you could just give a summary of your major findings about your country. Annabelle, could you start?
Yes, so Poland is pro-digital, supporting the digitization of public services and innovative companies. It favors a light touch to big tech platforms. At the same time, the nationalist government is traditionalist on religious and social issues, and this has spilled over into its approach to tech. From this perspective, Poland sees digital as an arm to promote its right-wing politics. So there is a paradox in Poland's digital policy. On the one hand, the government, led by Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, has been actively pro-digital. On the other hand, the government has tried to use digital sphere to further its own agenda, which has been a further source of tension with Brussels.
Yeah, that's interesting. Aurelien, you also found, let's say, French policy to be a bit schizophrenic. Could you tell us about French grandeur and dirigisme?
Yeah, sure. So first, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to discuss this chapter. Well, if there's one word that can just sum up perhaps the French digital policy, is sovereignty. Sovereignty everywhere, all the time, in terms of digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty when it comes to cloud, when it comes to building up some startups, and it's this idea of having a very assertive digital policy in Europe through France in order to be kind of independent or this kind of digital autonomy from the US, but also from China. And that is this idea or ideal of the French digital policy to have Europe as an autonomous digital power, and where France will be the main champion of this voice of digital sovereignty. And I think that can only be increased in the coming years with the latest elections in France, where, I mean, the extreme from far left to far right to even the center talk about digital sovereignty as a way to emancipate and to just be free from foreign power. So yeah, France has been a champion, for best or for worst, of digital sovereignty in Europe.
Yeah, digital sovereignty, it sounds like digital Gaullism to me a little bit.
Exactly, so, yeah. It is.
Yeah. Høst, in Copenhagen, Denmark proved surprising to me. Maybe you can unpack it in that it's a digital superstar, pioneer, but at the same time, it really found common cause with France in many ways. How do you explain it?
Well, I think it's not that surprising, Bill. It has to do with the fact that, okay, Denmark, on the one hand, favors a competitive internal market, which is open to the world. Denmark, therefore, is a bit skeptical on the concept of digital sovereignty, fearing protectionism. On the other hand, Denmark very much supports simple, strict regulation to secure a level playing field, consumer safety, and freedom of expression. So Denmark wants to align online with offline rules. What is illegal offline should be illegal online also. And Denmark has also taken a tough line on regulation and on platforms' responsibility for safety of products and removal of illegal content.
Yeah, no, it was surprising. We've seen here in Brussels, the Danish commissioner, antitrust commissioner, Margrethe Vestager, and the French commissioner, Thierry Breton, find common cause in many ways. But you're saying that isn't surprising. In many ways, they share the same
not
goals.
as one looks at the traditions in Denmark.
Yeah,
that's right.
Interesting. So, Janna, in Milan, how did you find Italy? It sort of was a digital laggard, but you're finding that it's changing tune and accelerating in many ways, right?
Yes, I would say that kind of the theme of my report is that Italy is finally taking digital seriously. It's something that the country's been talking about for a long time. It's been tinkering around the edges, but it lagged behind much of Europe in terms of broadband internet penetration, digital skills. It was the last major European country to adopt a national cybersecurity plan. And I think that now we're seeing for the first time, thanks to the pandemic, a more comprehensive approach, a big injection of funding. And so I think that, digital trends here have really accelerated in the last 2 years in a way that was really difficult to imagine, frankly, prior to COVID-19.
Yeah, one thing that you wrote that really struck me was how aging Italian CEOs were finally getting hooked on Zoom, so we could do Zoom interviews with them too here. And let's take a step back for each of you. Part of the reports do look at the sort of basic connectivity and basic digital infrastructure in many of your countries. Could you just outline where you see them standing? It seemed, Annabelle, it seems like Poland's kind of patchy, that it has cheap internet access, but it's uneven. Is that correct?
That's true. That's one of the things that the pandemic highlighted too, that not everybody had the same access to broadband, which obviously had implications for children's ability to go to school, for example, and study remotely. And I think that's been a big priority to not only increase the provision of digital services, administrative services, but also ensure that they reach a wider part of the population.
Yeah. And Aurelien, one of the interesting things I thought from your report was France is kind of a digital superstar. I mean, it has all these unicorns. Can you speak to how can it, those are companies that with more than 1 billion euros of capitalization, but how can France be, in a sense, protectionist, but also quite innovative?
Yeah, I think it's because it's successful that the French digital policy is very assertive, right? It's because there's a French digital tech landscape, what we call the French tech, that is quite successful, that it allows French policymakers to be that assertive because they really believe, and sometimes, legitimately, they really believe that they can compete with the large tech companies because there are some dynamic digital capabilities. So, for example, in 2020, France was ranked second after Switzerland in all OECD countries in adopting high-speed subscriptions broadband for per 100 inhabitants. So that's quite good. Also, the price for broadband is very cheap in France. The French venture capital market is the third in Europe after the UK, which is 32 billion euros of capitalizations. Then Germany, 16 billions of euros of market capitalizations. And then you have France of 11 billions of market capitalization. So the venture capital market is working. And there was this goal, you refer to unicorn, there was this goal in 2014 to have basically 26 unicorns by 2025, right? And these goals were achieved already in 2021. So this goal, which was set for 2025, is already just completed in 2021. So we see that there's some real success in this French digital policy, and that these few successes creates the ground for the assertiveness of the French digital policy, because they really believe that they have the capabilities to do something, and that's why they are the most vocal voice in European projects such as Gaia X, which is the European sovereign cloud. They say, we can do it, so let's not rely on Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or Amazon Cloud, and let's build our own. And so the capabilities of the French tech companies create this sort of protectionist, sovereign assertiveness. It's only because it's already kind of successful that it enables the French policymakers to have some claims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Maybe you could just tell our listeners a little bit about, I've heard names like BlaBlaCar, Mano.
Right.
What are these, and I guess it's because France has very strong engineering talent and now a liquid venture capital market. But
it's also, that's true. I mean, the strongest strength of France is its human capital in terms of mathematicians, in terms of engineering. France wants to create a Silicon Valley, outside Paris, which is called Paris Clays, just in the middle of agricultural farms. They're going to create the new Silicon Valley, where different elite universities going to come together with companies, and they're injecting billions of euros in creating this new Silicon Valley. They even create a metro line that's going to go from Paris to that area. So I think the human capital of in France create these capabilities. There's a lot of engineers. There's of course a lot of brain drains of French engineers going to the US, and now they're trying to bring back these engineers. But you have some success stories like BlaBlaCar, and even on the blockchain, you have a number of French startups that are successful. You have, for example, OVH, which is a leading cloud company in Europe. So there's this kind of confidence and really willingness to build on this human capital in order to scale up. And I mean, also the French government, has always been very active in the market economy, right? This kind of Colbertist, state-led industrial policy. We have a new French economic minister, Bruno Le Maire. He hasn't changed, but at least his title has changed. Now he's a French minister for industrial and digital sovereignty. So you see that it's not only digital sovereignty, it's industrial sovereignty. And so you take these big companies like Orange or Capgemini, like the Total or big industrial champions of France, and the state put some money into those companies and try to scale them up. So in France, clearly, big is not bad and big is beautiful as long as it's French. So as long as it is French, big is really beautiful. And there's this idea of a Colbertist view of France where you create the bigness internally. But in order to create the bigness internally, well, you need to have some protectionist measures. And since you have European rules that, of course, prohibit protectionism, you have, what you can call protectionism in disguise, which is so sort of privacy shield, digital sovereignty, where, just to take an example, on the cloud, they created their own label, the so-called trusted cloud, the cloud de confiance. What does it mean? So it means that if you're only a French cloud provider, you can pretend to have this label. So, of course, if you're an American cloud provider or a Chinese cloud provider, you will never have a label of trusted cloud. So, you see, it means that foreign cloud providers are distrusted. And so you create this kind of subsidies or protectionism that helps the French companies to grow big through internal policies.
And protectionism, others would call it. But in any case,
yes.
Jan Høst, how does that sound to you in Denmark? Denmark is even more digitally advanced in many ways than France. It has a low connectivity costs, excellent internet access, lots of startups, so forth.
Yeah, and it's presumably going well so far. But of course, one is from the point of view of public authorities very well aware that as we are a very small country, just below 6 million, we also a small economy, and we cannot, deal with things unless we have excellence. But the approach is a bit different. We have a huge public sector, but that's because we have a huge welfare state. And part of the welfare state is an excellent educational system where, since some time, different governments have sort of pushed for more digital knowledge amongst the youngsters. On top of that, in the huge public sector and in the relations between citizens and the public sector, you are going digital since 10 years because almost 90% of citizens are communicating using the public sector mailbox in their relations with the public sector. And something like 80% of Danish citizens report that they trust the public sector with respect to keeping their data safe. I think that's pretty amazing. And whether it's entirely true or not, it's still a very high figure. And I think that's part of our, let's say, we don't have, a lot of big firms. We have Maersk, we have Novo Nordisk, whatever, but we don't have a lot of them. But we have a very, let's say, relatively large part of the population, very well educated and ready to go on. But of course, we know that we really have to keep it up. We are well situated for the moment, for example, on connectivity. But I also report on a story there where it shows that planning regulation, which is also the case in other EU countries, are hindering setting up mobile masts to some extent, and therefore, slowing down, the objectives of some of the digital strategies.
Yeah, to get fast speed wireless. You were talking about the mobile masts. Yeah. Janna, in Italy, it's not quite as developed as in Denmark. I know Italy did have very strong mobile phone connections, maybe less problems with masts, I don't know. But what is the situation in Italy now? Is it a laggard or average?
I think it depends if you're talking about the provision of government services. We obviously also have a very big public administration here, a very robust health system, and that is managed by the regional governments that has been trying to digitize. We have a huge tax administration operation. Italy is notorious for tax evasion. And so the tax administration has been trying to use digital tools to reduce the tax gap. But I'm not sure that these efforts are as successful as it sounds like France and Denmark. Even just looking at some of the websites, they look like kind of 1990s, early 2000s. Yeah. I think that Italians as individuals have started to really embrace digital. I think that, we love our BlaBlaCar, we love our WhatsApp. Even Nona grandparents, are getting in on, FaceTime and all of that. And so I think that something interesting too is that the mobile seems to have kind of leapfrogged over some of the fixed broadband. You can get a cell phone plan with 140 gigabytes of data for €6 a month. And so there are people saying, well, why should I pay 25 or 30 for unlimited broadband that I'm not using anyway? And so, there's just been sort of this hodgepodge, this kind of, I think, uneven development in certain areas.
No, that's very interesting. Let's stick with Italy. You talk in your report a lot about the impact of COVID. We've discussed a little bit that it really changed attitudes. It's true. My memory of Italy is of a lot of cases against at Google or banning Uber, a lot of entrenched interests that resisted, let's say, digitization. I guess with the new administration also of Mario Draghi, that's changing, isn't it? And COVID they're counting on that to really move forward, the COVID funding.
Definitely. I mean, I think that, you really can't overstate the impact of COVID here on all kinds of levels, not just in terms of digitization. Italy was the first European country to be hit. We had some of the strictest lockdowns in all of Europe, if not the world, outside of Asia. We had almost all businesses closed for 8 weeks. We had no warning. I think other countries were able to kind of see what was coming in a way that Italy wasn't. There was a very, very high mortality rate, especially here in Milan. And so all these things that, Italian business, sort of the backbone of the economy, are these small and medium enterprises that sort of felt like they didn't really need to worry too much about digital, except maybe in their industrial plans. But in terms of, managing people and their way of doing business, I just anecdotally, I have friends who are IT managers who've been trying to get their bosses to take cybersecurity seriously for years. But these kind of mid-sized companies were like, well, why would we worry about that? We're not GE, And so the pandemic, I think, really, really forced all of these business leaders to recognize that this is no longer a question of convenience. It's no longer something that's optional. It's something that our offices are closed. Either we do this and we stay in business, or we don't do it and we're done. And so I think that was really kind of the driving force behind a lot of Italy's changes.
Yeah.
No, and Jan Høst, you also talk, their COVID funding is going to be important for digital in Denmark, perhaps not like as important as Italy, but is it key?
Not if we are talking about the money from the EU funding. Yes, there is, real stuff in that, but it's about, I think it's about 0.34 billion euros in total for a country like Denmark. And 25% roughly is going to be used for various digital sort of projects. But at the same time, the government has set up a digital strategy also with an additional 0.3 billion euros also. Now, I think what happened was that, yes, COVID was very important also for Denmark in terms of digitizing, because, work from home, connections, business to business, entirely using the net, meetings on Zoom, Teams, etc., whatever. And I think that has meant a lot for a number of small and medium-sized businesses, which are the ballpark of what's going on in Denmark. On the other hand, when you look at e-commerce, total e-commerce was reduced slightly because there was a drop in online traveling, online requests for traveling. And that's a huge business in Denmark. And it was not compensated for by the increase that we also experienced in people's purchasing of products via e-commerce. But what we have also seen there is a huge increase in the number of elderly people from 74 and upwards who have gone on the net. I mean, there was a change that of almost 25% from 2019 to 2021. And that will probably also, live with us in the hopefully non-COVID future. So.
Okay, let's move to the policy areas. One of the big concerns in Europe has been how to deal with illegal or at least harmful speech. And part of the Digital Services Act is meant to regulate that. Annabelle, in Poland, though, they had a sort of a different take. I think where France and others were very concerned about hate speech and wanted to put controls on social media, Poland sort of was uncomfortable. Why? Could you tell us?
So when you say Poland, I'm sure you mean the Polish government, yes. And especially some of the more right-wing, socially conservative elements within this ruling coalition who see efforts to regulate content online on Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms as a form of censorship. And over the past year, there has been an outcry against this. For example, when Facebook took down the page of some nationalists at one point, the government was defending these people who had been posting there and criticizing Facebook, even though they have political differences. So I think their bigger concern is that Facebook and so on could somehow intervene and seek to shape the debate and censor right-wing ideas.
A little bit like we hear of the Republicans in the United States. So that same debate between Republicans and Democrats has come to Europe, at least with Poland and the rest. Jan Høst, Denmark, though, I always think of Denmark as very free expression minded, deep tradition of a free press, yet it also agreed to go along with more responsibility on Facebook and other platforms. Why?
Well, that's, as I mentioned, this motto, what is illegal offline should also be illegal online. And the platforms should abide by the rules. And also, when you, as in Denmark, have a long-lasting tradition for a rather well-developed, some would say heavy-handed consumer protection, offline, that should also be the case online. And that was part of why you saw the Danish authorities, especially the centre-left government, pushing for example, in brackets, a more direct responsibility for the platforms for the safety of the products that are launched or dealt with on their platforms. Instead, you got an indirect, responsibility in the final, political compromise on the Digital Services Act.
No, it was interesting.
The same thing. I mean, the government wanted to set a very strict 24-hour limit after notification made to a platform that you have illegal content or hate speech on your platform. Get rid of it. You have 24 hours. That's it, right? Yeah. Now, there is not that deadline in the final compromise. But then again, there is still, I mean, preventive measures, and the platforms have to set up audits, which can be controlled by the authorities.
Yeah, it was surprising to me to hear Denmark being the most aggressive on trying to.
The government was very aggressive. I mean, yes. It even tried to introduce Danish rules after the political compromise was made in Brussels on the 24-hour limit, but then a majority in the Danish parliament was hesitant, so it was against the minority center-left government, and also the Commission was, I think, exercising a bit of push and saying, you cannot do that. In 1.5 years, we have different rules, and you have signed them.
No, I agree. And one of the things I heard here in Brussels was that Italy, for example, really did oppose a lot of these very tough measures on e-commerce that the Danish representatives were pressing for. Janna, I mean, I guess e-commerce has been, I know Amazon has faced significant tax fines, and there's been other types of regulatory antitrust actions, but something seems to be changing in your country towards e-commerce. Could you explain? And they really didn't want to. They want to encourage it in some ways.
Yeah, this is, again, going back to the pandemic when for almost 2 full months, I think, every store in Italy was closed except the supermarket and the pharmacy. And so Italians had to basically start shopping online for the first time. I can say personally, I never shopped online here before the pandemic because it's just the postal service wasn't reliable. The couriers, do that thing where they leave a note saying they tried to deliver the package when you've been there the whole time and they didn't really try. And so I think that, as much as the Italian government has really gone after Amazon, like you said, with taxes and antitrust, Amazon was slapped with €1 billion fine here, which is pretty remarkable. But the pandemic kind of showed individuals that there is such a thing as reliable e-commerce and that there are some benefits to it. There are products that you can't get in the store down the street. And so I think that the government is kind of being forced to be more open to it in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah, and opposing the Danish push, that's for sure. What about the other big piece of legislation in Europe has been the Digital Markets Act. It targets a handful of American companies, big digital companies, puts restrictions on their activities. How did your countries react to that? I know that, Aurelien, you wrote a fair amount about that in your profile. Could you tell us what your conclusion was? Yeah,
sure. I can perhaps start with the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. Yeah. Definitely, France has been one of the most vocal voice for this piece of regulation, and for the European Commission to introduce that piece of regulation. It reverts back to what I just said before, in a way that, in order to help European business users, European startups, and especially French startups, there is a need to break up or to really band the power of the US tech companies. And that's the French analysis, that's the French perceptions, and it's cross-party. So irrespective of the French election results lately, I think that's going to be a very, very well-shared approach. I mean, the French have been extremely active in the Digital Market Act negotiations. I mean, think of the French presidency from January 2022 to June 2022, where Cédric O, the digital French minister, was as a representative of the EU Council of Ministers, was part of the signatory of the final agreement on the Digital Markets Act. You can also think of Stéphanie Yon-Corten, who was the rapporteur of the Econ of the Digital Markets Act for the Econ Committee in the European Parliament. So she made sure that the European Parliament would push for that for that version. And as you see, through the negotiations, from the European Commission's proposals, the European Parliament has even strengthened and increased the number of obligations and has reduced at least the scope of the number of companies to be included in this piece of legislation, just to target especially US tech companies and potentially 2 or 3 Chinese tech companies. So, I mean, the very idea of the Digital Market Act is to really curb the power of this digital ecosystem, the biggest, in order to give some entitlements to business users, to European startups. So these European startups will be entitled to have a wide range of access. And even though they have entitlement on some proprietary assets of the digital ecosystems they will operate on. And that will have a chilling effect, a deterrent effect on the innovation capabilities of these ecosystems to invest, create, disrupt, since whatever they disrupt, whatever they will innovate, they will know that they will have to share with their own rivals these innovations. And that is just not the way entrepreneurs can derive rents. So irrespective of those concerns, the French policy has been very active on the Digital Markets Act and also active on the kind of decentralized enforcement of the Digital Markets Act, where you see the Autorité de la Concurrence, which pushing with a Bundeskartellamt for the Digital Markets Act not to be enforced only by the European Commission, but to have basically 27 sorts of enforcement mechanism, just to increase the probability for lawsuits, probability for enforcement in the decentralized level. I mean, the French, the German, and the Polish prime minister signed some memorandum of the so-called Friends of the DMA, where they say, well, we need to improve the DMA. And what is improve the DMA is, of course, a decentralized enforcement of the DMA. Say, well, the European Commission cannot do the job by itself. Let us do the job. And what is doing the job is just to further the number of obligations and to increase the number of lawsuits. So this is the so-called Friends of the DMA. Which
and in Italy, Janna, you've written about how the antitrust authority has become quite aggressive, I think, in recent times. Let's turn to transatlantic relations. This obviously the DMA was pretty popular. It went through in record speed. You know, the privacy rules took 6 years to negotiate. This took a mere year and is going to go into effect, the Digital Markets Act in 2024 already. Will this poison, from your perspective, transatlantic relations, or do your countries really have a sense of that they want to avoid a conflict with America? Is that important? Or maybe you, because France is the most, should we say, hesitant about the Atlantic Alliance. How would you see this? And then we'll move to the others.
The transatlantic, I think it's a contradiction, right? In some way, the French will always make sure that the transatlantic partnerships is strong and very lively, but at the same time, the assertiveness of the French policy will lead these transatlantic digital and tech partnerships to lead to almost, I think, nothing, because the assertiveness is that the French will always enforce the strongest privacy shield, the strongest cloud autonomy, and that will very much conflict with American laws. And any kind of partnership in the cloud or any will never be accepted. As long as you don't have the data centers in Europe, that will never be acceptable for the French to locate the data of Europeans outside Europe. And at least I think what I'm saying is that the French will be willing to engage in those negotiations, to engage in the transatlantic partnerships, but they will not push for common positions and common solutions. I don't see that coming, because the question is the location of data. They will always want the data center to be in Europe. They will always want these large tech companies never to share data with the US government, which by the American laws, they are compelled to do so. So these are like complete contradictions and oppositions, so that at the end of the day, I think there might be some regulatory and legal dispute, real legal dispute. When I'm saying this, I'm thinking about a WTO dispute where, big disputes are sometimes resolved at the WTO. Let's think about Airbus and Boeing, or a big dispute like this. So I think that will be the end of the day.
And Høst, do Danes see it in the same light? The Transatlantic Digital Partnership, is it something more positive to Denmark?
Basically, I don't know if it is more positive than the French would say it is for them, because as was said, I mean, the French, nevertheless, despite all the rhetoric, I mean, still relies a lot on the cooperation with the Americans, also on businesses, right? And yes, for Denmark, it's certainly the case. And the line from the Danish side has been, since the beginning of the discussion on the DMA, yes, we go along with the strict line of the Commission, but we don't want just to hit the Americans. I mean, it should be for. And that goes with the premise, as I highlighted in my introduction, that to Denmark, what we are talking about is a well-functioning internal market, which is open to the rest of the world. So that's definitely clear. But on the other hand, I mean, yes, for a strict line on pushing competition, if you are big, there are certain considerations that you have to take into account. For example, not favoring your own systems and so on.
Okay, Janna, Annabelle, how do Poland and Italy view American big tech? Either of you want to make a comment? Go ahead, Annabelle.
So Poland doesn't see tech as a zero-sum game, and I think the government realizes that the country can't sort of go it alone, and in order to be competitive, it needs to work with other partners in the European Union and the United States, and then other partners such as Japan and other NATO countries, but sort of this Western alliance, and it doesn't sort of see the Brussels officials or the American tech as necessarily a competitor.
Janna?
I would say that Italy also has a fairly pragmatic approach. It's definitely not as vocal as France, although it is sort of quietly antagonistic, I think, towards American tech companies. I think it's the only country in Europe that has levied 100 million euro plus fines against almost all the major American players. So that's Facebook, Apple, Google, in addition to Amazon, Uber Eats recently. So I think that there is a lot of skepticism towards these companies, but on the other hand, there is a deep recognition in Italy that Italy cannot do this alone. And, we're one of the biggest recipients of the COVID recovery funds. Italy is getting 195 million euros. A quarter of that is being allocated to digitization, but there are very strict implementation deadlines for these funds. And there's just no way that any of this money is going to get spent in a productive way unless Italian companies are teaming up with American companies to get these projects done.
Interesting. Okay, we're coming to the end of I think, a fascinating discussion. Any final words? Maybe each of you, we could do a tour de table, and each of you could have some conclusion, maybe also look at the impact of Russia and the invasion of Ukraine and whether that has changed the attitude toward America, and whether your countries are maybe also, how do they see Chinese tech? Are they aggressively anti-Chinese, or do you see them trying to find equidistance? Maybe I'll begin with you, Aurelien, for the conclusion, because I think France is the one that does preach equidistance.
Yeah, I think the French digital policy is interesting because, as I started my point, there's some capabilities and potential. There's a real potential, and it's because of this potential they create this assertiveness. And the voice of France will be very influential in Europe, together with Germany, of course, and other countries. But I wish they will use these capabilities in order to create more collaborations with transatlantic partners. That's my wish, that there would be more collaborative, because all these attempts to create the next French Google, the next French Microsoft, the next French Amazon, I think these are wasted money. I mean, it's like government money most of the time. These are money from subsidies from the government into startups that endlessly fail. So rather than just creating these competitors in a very confrontational perspective, I wish there would be more collaborations for French startups and French companies to evolve and collaborate and flourish on those ecosystems. I think it can be a win-win situations. And like of the Russian war, I think some French policymakers are starting to open their eyes. They're like, not all foreign powers are equal, and you cannot treat Russia just like the US in terms of the French assertiveness, or you cannot treat the US as China. And we see also a military threat in China when it comes to Taiwan. So we know the Russian war today, but maybe we should just foresee also negative outcomes in the near future in China. And in light of that, I think the French and more generally the European digital policy should have an alliance between democracies. You can share data among democracies, and sharing data between democracy and dictatorships or authoritarian governments is completely different. So all these very distrust attitude of Europeans and French especially towards sharing data with American governments or whatever, I think is just perhaps overblown, and it's just overstated when surprisingly they don't have those concerns sharing data with Huawei or TikTok. And I think that I don't understand, or at least I understand, and I'm sad to understand it. So I wish there would be more collaborations, and the best way would be with the transatlantic partnerships to deliver some outcomes. But that will need a change of attitude, especially from European, but also from the French, especially to really be committed to deliver outcomes, not just rhetoric, not just discussions. Because until now, the French are just committed to engage in discussions with no credible willingness to deliver outcomes.
Interesting. Janna, turning to you, any final thoughts? I know Italy is particularly close to China in trade relations. I've seen Alibaba actually has a lot of business in Italy, more than anywhere else, in helping Italian exporters reach the Chinese market and vice versa. How do you see Italy taking on China, and any final thoughts on its digital future?
Well, I think that Italy historically has had a very interesting role in kind of balancing relations with the East and West as this kind of transition geography. And I think now, Italy is a very enthusiastic member of the EU. It's very supportive of European policy, so it wants to be a good European. On the other hand, it does have a very strong transatlantic relationship that it wants to preserve, and it knows it's reliant on American technology. And then you bring in, this this Chinese leg of the stool, I guess. And it is true that especially the previous government was the first G7 country to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So there was a very strong signal that there was willingness to cooperate, at least economically, with China. Mario Draghi has kind of walked that back a bit. He's vetoed some acquisitions of Chinese companies that wanted to acquire Italian tech companies. Those transactions have been vetoed. And so we're kind of seeing a pivot away from that stronger Chinese cooperation from the previous government. But at the same time, Italy is a big recipient of foreign direct investment from China. There are strong ties in a lot of sectors, also the luxury goods sector. So I think that Italy is just going to kind of be continuing this historic pattern of trying to balance all these different relationships.
Interesting. Annabelle, any final thoughts on Poland and its place in the digital future world?
So, as I said, I think Poland sees this broader Western cooperation as really important. Poland has always been calling and, alerting the rest of the world to the danger from Russia. And I think it's becoming increasingly aware of the Chinese threat as well. So there are likely to be elections in Poland in the next year, which could result in a change in government. But I think regardless of who is elected, this Western focus will continue.
Interesting. Jan Høst, some final words.
Yes, I mean, as a small country, Denmark is, of course, increasingly aware of, let's say, its dependencies on its transatlantic relationships, which are traditionally very good, but also on its relationships with the rest of the EU. And we lately saw that we got rid of one of our opt-outs on defense and joined the defense cooperation also on the EU side, well within NATO as was. We do have established a rather good trade relationships with China. We even have a panda relationship with the pandas in Copenhagen. On the other hand, Huawei was excluded from the project on development and roll-up of 5G in Denmark because 5G is, of course, considered to be critical infrastructure. On the other hand, public authorities can still order Chinese tech products, phones, routers, switches via what is called SKI, which is the public Danish purchasing manager for central and local governments. So we are balancing a little bit between, but with clearly, eyes on the transatlantic and the EU relationships. That's clear.
Well, thank you all. I want to thank our four authors for taking the time to speak with us. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. We've really seen how Europe is not homogeneous on digital, that it has different views. It has some commonalities as well, and has managed to find compromises on major pieces of legislation. It would be balancing both East and West. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has forced a digital rethinking, a thinking of how to work together on digital issues with the United States, but there'll be tensions, as we've heard, in places like France, particularly. And there's no consensus that the Chinese tech, or no idea that Chinese tech is as dangerous as the American administration makes out to be. I think those are the conclusions I take away from the conversation. I again want to thank you, and I hope our listeners will take the time to read the report, which is being launched today, and which includes the 4 wonderful chapters on Poland, Italy, France, and Denmark. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.